I'm Rob Hunter from Salida, Colorado. My task today is to demonstrate Module 5, or the passage of suture through the rotator cuff. To do this, we need a few basic instruments. We need a grasping instrument that will grasp sutures. We need a grasping instrument that will not allow sutures to slide. We need a piercing instrument with an opening and shutting jaw. We need instruments to pass sutures through tissue that allow us to pass a monofilament in and out of the joint. And we need an instrument that allows us to penetrate the rotator cuff and pass the suture in one step. To demonstrate this, I'm going to use the FAST workstation in 3 different stages. 1, open, so we can work directly at it. 2, with a clear plastic dome. And finally, with the opaque dome, using an arthroscope to visualize what we're trying to accomplish. The first method of passing suture through a rotator cuff is called pierce and pass. And it requires an instrument that allows you to penetrate the rotator cuff and at the same time pass the suture through the rotator cuff. To do this, we'll take one of the limbs of our simulated anchor. We'll create a loop. We'll pass the loop into our instrument. And when we close, as we advance our needle, we'll be able to pass a suture through the rotator cuff and then retrieve it in one stage. So I will again pass this onto our instrument, and I will approach the rotator cuff, and I'll grab the rotator cuff. And once you have a grasp of the rotator cuff, you can actually move the rotator cuff, and you can move it forward, back, you can move it lateral, you can move it medial to get a good sense about what kind of tension you're going to apply if you choose that spot to pass your suture. If we like that position, then by deploying our trigger, we can pass the suture through the tissue and let the needle pass back through the tissue. In order to finish the task, we have to introduce a second instrument into the shoulder and grasp the suture that's been passed through the rotator cuff. One of our rules is only one instrument moves in the shoulder at a time. So once I've grasped this suture, we'll release the instrument that passed it in the first place, remove that instrument out the working cannula, and then retrieve our suture through the rotator cuff. Once it's been passed through the rotator cuff, we can use our suture grasping instrument to pass through the portal, retrieve the suture, and deliver it back so that we have completed the task. The second way to pass a suture through tissue is called pierce and grab. And to do that, we need a sharp instrument that has a jaw that allows us to penetrate the rotator cuff and then retrieve the suture on the other side. We penetrate the rotator cuff from above, and by working carefully, we can penetrate through the rotator cuff to the area of our suture by opening the jaw. We can grasp one of the suture limbs and then pull it back through the rotator cuff. Now, one of the features of this that we have to be careful of is that as you pull this loop through the rotator cuff, you can pull both limbs through the anchor at the same time. And if you're not careful about that, as you pull your suture through, you can offload your anchor. So by identifying the suture that belongs still, we can then selectively pull the appropriate suture through the rotator cuff and allow that suture to pass without actually seeing any suture sliding back and forth through the anchor. And that preserves the suture in the anchor and will not result in offloading of the suture. Then we'll reach in with our suture grasper, grab the suture that's been passed, and restore it out the cannula. The third way to pass a suture through the rotator cuff is called pierce and shuttle. And to do that, we have to introduce a curved instrument that allows us to penetrate the rotator cuff, then deploy a monofilament by retrieving the monofilament out the shoulder and retrieving the appropriate permanent suture through the same cannula. We can then draw back through the rotator cuff and bring the suture through the cuff. So the first thing I will do is to penetrate the rotator cuff from above, where I want the ultimate stitch to end up. And by rotating through the rotator cuff, I can deliver the tip of the instrument. I'll deploy my loop. I'll reach in with a grasping forceps. I'll grab that limb and deliver it out the cannula. Once I've delivered it out the cannula, I can reach in with my suture grabbing instrument and grab the suture that I want to deliver, retrieve it out the same cannula. I will pass that suture through the loop of monofilament and create a loop on a loop. It's important to pass this and to secure the loop so that there aren't twists and tangles in the system, because if there are, it can block your passage of the suture back through the rotator cuff. Once I have this firmly grasped and seated, I'll pull my monofilament back, and with it I will pull the loop of suture through the rotator cuff and out the cannula. Then I can reach in with my suture grabbing instrument, I can retrieve the suture, and I can again deliver it back out the storage cannula. 3 ways to pass suture through the rotator cuff. I'm going to demonstrate on the FAST workstation the 3 methods of passing suture through rotator cuff with this translucent dome that we can see through in order to work. The first method of passing the suture through the rotator cuff is called pierce and carry. This is a method that employs one of many devices that allows us to grab the rotator cuff and then carry the suture through the rotator cuff with a needle that drives the suture through the cuff in one step. When we do this work, what I'm simulating is that I'm standing posterior. The storage cannula, the suture management cannula is anterior, and I'd typically be working from a lateral position in order to accomplish the tasks that we're going to do in a moment. So the first technique that I'd like to show is called pierce and carry. And to do this, I'll come through a lateral portal. I'm going to grab a suture. And when we pass multiple sutures, we work from anterior to posterior to pass the sutures so that we continue to work over an open field and don't have to work over sutures that get in our way. So I'm going to grab the anterior suture first, and I'm going to deliver it out the lateral working cannula. One of the rules that we have when we're moving suture through anchors and through the shoulder is that the arthroscope always points directly at the anchor as you're moving suture to make certain that as you're pulling the suture, you're not in fact pulling it through the anchor and offloading the anchor. Once we have the suture out our working cannula, we're going to make a loop. We're going to deliver the suture into our instrument. We're going to deliver it back through the lateral cannula, open the jaws, and grab the rotator cuff. Where you grab it depends on where the anchor is, how much good tendon you've got, and by grabbing it and using this as a grasper, you can mobilize the cuff to make certain that you like where it is in position relative to the rest of the cuff. And if you like it there, then we'll deliver the needle through the rotator cuff and with it a loop of suture. Once we delivered it through, we introduce a second instrument, typically through our suture storage cannula. So I'm going to introduce the instrument and I'm going to grab the suture that's been passed through the rotator cuff. One of our rules is one instrument moves in the shoulder at a time. So once I've got a good grip on the rotator cuff suture, I'll release the instrument, draw it back out the lateral working cannula, and once it's out, I'll then deliver the suture back through the storage cannula and complete the task. The second method of passing a suture through the rotator cuff is called pierce and grab. And to do this, we're going to take a sharp instrument that has a jaw that allows us to penetrate the rotator cuff, open the jaw, retrieve a suture, and pull it back through the rotator cuff. And you can use whatever accessory portal you need that allows you to approach the rotator cuff in such a way that you can penetrate it and then grab the suture. So here we'll penetrate through the rotator cuff. And oftentimes this is a combination of penetration and rotation so that you deliver the instrument where the suture is being stored. We'll open the jaw. We'll grab the appropriate suture, rotate it back through the rotator cuff, and deliver the suture back out the cannula. Now here we have to look very carefully to make certain that we're not offloading the anchor as we pull it through. And if we are, you can grab the suture that stabilizes the suture through the anchor and then deliver the suture all the way through the rotator cuff. Once we've passed it through the rotator cuff, we'll put our suture grasping instrument through the storage cannula, grab our suture, and retrieve it back out our suture management or suture storage cannula. The third method of passing a suture through the rotator cuff is called pierce and shuttle. And to do this, we're going to employ an instrument that allows us to penetrate the rotator cuff, push a monofilament or a monofilament loop through the rotator cuff, pass the appropriate suture into the monofilament loop, and then deliver it back out through the rotator cuff. We will enter the rotator cuff from above. We'll penetrate the rotator cuff, and again, it's a combination of pushing and rotating so that we can deliver the instrument through the rotator cuff. Once we have it delivered, we'll deploy our loop. We will reach through our lateral working cannula, grasp the loop, and deliver it out our lateral working cannula. Like so. Once we've delivered the monofilament out the working cannula, we'll go back through the working cannula with our suture grasping instrument. We'll retrieve the appropriate suture, in this case the posterior most suture, and pull it out our lateral working cannula. And again, if the suture is sliding through the anchor, grab one limb or the other and pull it to see which limb you hold to stabilize the suture in the anchor. That way we're not offloading our anchor. Once I've got the suture and the loop through the working cannula, I will pass the suture through the loop, And I'm going to create a loop in my suture and a loop in the monofilament, and then I'm going to guide this back through the cannula to the rotator cuff so that I have a very simple loop passing through the rotator cuff. This will allow it to pass relatively easily, and I will pass it until I can deliver it out the accessory portal. Once it's passed effectively and successfully through the rotator cuff, I'll go back through our suture management, suture storage cannula, grasp the suture, and store it. This gives us three good sutures passed through the rotator cuff using the 3 different methods for passage. I'm going to show the 3 ways of passing suture through rotator cuff. The first method is called pierce and carry. And to do that, I'm going to grab a suture through my lateral portal, and I'm going to grab it, the most anterior suture, through these simulated anchors. This is a simulated anchor, and if this were an anchor, I'm grabbing the suture closest to the rotator cuff, and I'm pulling this out. Now, one of our rules is if you're retrieving a suture through the shoulder, your arthroscope stays on the anchor so that as you retrieve your suture, you can see whether you're sliding your suture through the anchor or not. In the perfect setting, there's no motion of the suture through the anchor as the suture is being retrieved. And if there is, can you hold the scope for me? If there is, what you can do is reach in into your working cannula and grab one limb or the other and pull on it. You can see that that's stabilizing my suture. And now I can retrieve the suture out the cannula without inadvertently offloading my anchor. Because if you see motion like that, then you're going to offload your anchor unless you stop it and somehow avoid that motion through the anchor. Once I've retrieved my anchor through the working cannula, I will place it into my instrument, and I will pass it back through my working cannula. Got it now. And I will open, and I will grab the cuff, and you can look now to see where you are relative to your anchor. Do you need to be more anterior? Do you need to be more posterior, more medial, more lateral? You can grab it, and you can move it in the living situation to see whether it's going to put the cuff where you want it to be when you tie it down. If we like that position, then we'll pass the suture through the anchor, through the cuff, and allow the needle to retract back underneath. Now at this point, we need to go find that suture and grab it. And it's better to give the arthroscope to your assistant and come in with your own grasping instrument, because I think it's much easier for you to triangulate using your own 2 hands than trying to triangulate with someone else's hands. So once we've grabbed the suture, then we'll release the passing instrument and retrieve it out the cannula. Our rule is 1 instrument moves in the shoulder at a time. So once I've released the passing instrument and it's out the cannula, then I'll retrieve this suture back out the working cannula, taking all the loops out so it's nice and tight again, and I'll store that suture out the storage cannula. The second method of passing a suture through the rotator cuff is called pierce and grab, and it employs an instrument that's sharp that allows us to penetrate the rotator cuff and then grab a suture. We'll use the appropriate accessory portal, and I will pass this down into the rotator cuff. Try. Until we see it where we want to end up pulling the suture through. And here we'll penetrate the rotator cuff. And it's a combination of penetration and rotation. Notice I'm rotating my instrument as I pass through until I'm down by my suture, and then we will open the jaws grab the appropriate suture, and pull it back through. Now, in a situation where it's a little difficult to grab the suture, I've got it here. What we can do at times is to pass a probe or an instrument through our lateral cannula and just place the suture where we want it to go. But in this case, I've retrieved it effectively, and now I'm going to pull that suture back out. Now notice, can you hold the scope for me right there? Notice that as I'm pulling it, I'm again tending to offload this anchor, and so I'm going to reach in and grab a suture. It's not that one. And I'm going to pull that back. Notice that that stabilizes the suture at the anchor, so there's no motion of suture in the anchor as you pull the suture through the rotator cuff. We want to avoid that. So if you see suture passing through your anchor, stop, stabilize the anchor, and then continue with your task. Then we'll reach in with our suture grasping instrument through our storage portal. We'll grab the suture, and we'll store it back out the storage cannula, which for me is typically anterior. The third method of passing a suture through the rotator cuff is called pierce and shuttle. And to do this, we'll take advantage of a sharp instrument that allows us to penetrate the rotator cuff and then deploy a monofilament through the rotator cuff, out the cannula, and then retrieve the appropriate permanent suture and pull it back through. So I'm going to penetrate the rotator cuff once again through an accessory portal. I'll grab the scope from you for a moment. So I'm going to determine where I want the rotator cuff suture to end, which is right there. I'll penetrate and I'll rotate. Passing through rotator cuff is not a matter of strength, it's finesse. And by penetrating and rotating, I can deliver the monofilament into the area of my suture. Then I'll deploy the monofilament, and I'll deploy adequate monofilament into the subacromial space so that I can easily then retrieve the monofilament out my lateral working cannula. And once I've retrieved the monofilament out the working cannula, I'm going to go back and retrieve the appropriate permanent suture. This is the posterior anchor suture. And I'm going to pull that through. And again, notice that I'm getting some motion. Can you hold the scope for me? I'm getting some motion, so I'll grab the suture limb. I'll pull back. That's the wrong one. I'll grab the suture limb. I'll pull back. That's the correct one. And I'll hold that suture. And now I can retrieve out the working cannula without seeing motion and offloading of my anchor. I'm going to pass the suture loop through the monofilament. And I'm going to create a loop of suture and a loop of monofilament. Then I'm going to retrieve my instrument by rotating it back through the rotator cuff, not yanking it through the cuff. And I'll deliver my monofilament loop with the loop of suture back through the rotator cuff, pull it through, and exit my accessory portal. And I'll pull the suture until all the slack is through. Then by reaching with my suture grasping forceps through my storage cannula, I can retrieve the suture and draw it back. And I've successfully passed 3 sutures through the rotator cuff using the 3 different methods: pierce and carry, pierce and grab, and pierce and shuttle. I'm going to show you a few pitfalls that you might encounter when you're trying to pass suture through the rotator cuff. And the first pitfall I'd like to show is grabbing the wrong suture. We want to start from anterior and pass the suture from anterior to the middle suture to posterior, so that as we pass sutures, we continue to work in an open field and don't have to work over ourselves. Imagine if you passed the middle suture first and it were coming out this way, and now you have to go over the top of that to get to your anterior suture, and it becomes a very awkward move. So the first mistake in a situation where you have multiple sutures like this is that rather than grabbing your anterior suture, you reach in your nest of multiple sutures in the subacromial space, and you inadvertently grab that one and pull it out. And if you do that and pass that suture, grab the other, there you go. If we grab that and subsequently pass it, could you hold that scope for me right there? I'm going to use the Pearson carry technique to show this. If we grab this suture now and place it anterior here, which is where you want to be if it were your anterior anchor, and you pass that suture through and retrieve it, like that. Now, when we're going to pass our second suture, first of all, we're going to look inside here, and we're going to see that rather than straight towards the anchor, that suture has a very oblique angle of attack, so when that gets tied, it's going to pull that rotator cuff to this anchor, which will cause a pucker and an odd load. But more importantly, now we're going to load this second anchor, and we look and we see, oh my God, this is the anchor that we really were supposed to load, and this will end up going here, and you'll end up with a crisscross of sutures underneath, which can block your ability to tie and will definitely change the resting load that your rotator cuff is likely to see. So mistake number one is placing the suture through the wrong anchor first. And the only way you can visualize that and avoid it is to make certain that as you're grabbing suture, you're looking at the anchor and you're grabbing the appropriate suture. Now, what I also will do on the outside of the shoulder is hemostat every anchor and every suture that I'm not actually working with at that moment, so that if you were to grab the wrong suture by mistake, you'd actually try to pull a hemostat through the cannula. And although we're strong, we're not quite that strong. And so I think one of the ways to avoid that is to look carefully at the anchor as you're grabbing your suture, and secondly, have a hemostat on that set of sutures and on that set of sutures so that they're stabilized outside the cannula, which will avoid inadvertently grabbing the wrong one. The second mistake you can cause is grabbing more than one suture, or grabbing a tangle of sutures. So if you pass your instrument into the space, if you're not careful, what I try to do is go over the top of all my sutures, find the one I need, open my instrument, and grab. If you come into the shoulder with your instrument open and grab your suture, you can grab multiple sutures by mistake, and as you pull those through, you have a cluster of sutures in your cannula that will make it impossible for you to get the appropriate suture positioned and placed effectively. So the way to avoid that is introduce your instrument closed, use your instrument as a probe to pull the other sutures out of your way, and when you're on top of the suture that you want, then open, grab, and retrieve. Don't put your instrument in open, because an open instrument is an instrument that can inadvertently catch sutures that you don't want as you're reaching for the one that you do want. Mistake number 3, offloading of an anchor. when we reach into a shoulder, particularly when you're doing a pierce and grab technique, when we pass an instrument into the shoulder and penetrate the cuff, to grab our suture, at this point, when we're going to grab our suture, if you're not careful, you notice that this jaw, and most of the instruments like it, have an opening that allows you to grab the suture in a sliding position. But if you're not careful and you grab it too close to the base like that, this now does not slide. And so as you pull it, you'll pull the other suture with the instrument. But even if you're in the right position where it's sliding nicely inside the instrument, as you pull this, it tends to pull that suture through the anchor. If you continue on this path, what will happen is you retrieve your suture out your accessory cannula. You will pull both limbs until you get to the point where you're about to pull that suture all the way through the shoulder. And if you continue along that line, this is what will happen. That suture starts to head down, and left uncorrected, you will pull that suture all the way through. And once you've offloaded an anchor that's been buried beneath the bone, it's impossible to load it again and you'll lose it. Now, the way to avoid this is always to be certain that when you're retrieving a suture through the shoulder, that the arthroscope is looking directly at the anchor. And if you see motion at the anchor, the way to avoid this is if you see motion at the anchor as you're retrieving, you stop, you reach in, and either with an instrument or on the outside, you grab the suture so that as you move the suture through the rotator cuff, you don't see any motion at the anchor at all. There should be no motion of the anchor suture while you're pulling through the rotator cuff. If you see it, stop it. One more point about passing multiple sutures through the rotator cuff. It's rare, if not, it's very rare and perhaps never occurs that you're only going to be passing one suture through a rotator cuff to obtain some sort of functional repair. Because of that, you have to think about the sequence of passage. We want to pass from front to back. And the reason is that we stay out of our way, so that every pass we make is in an open field. If you start with the easiest suture to find and to grab, which oftentimes is this posterior suture, if we pass this posterior suture in a nice spot, let's say we like that a lot, we pass the suture. If you'd hold that scope again, I'm going to reach in and retrieve it, and I've done everything right. I've watched where I've passed the suture. I've grabbed it with my instrument. I've released it off the cuff. I've retrieved it out, and now I take this second instrument and pull it through. Everything has been done correctly as it relates to the passage. However, I've passed the posterior anchor first. And now I'm in a position where I have to pass the next one anterior. And you can see that now as I start to work, I have to get this out of my way, which is awkward. I have to reach underneath, find this suture, pull it out, and try to pass it here without running into these sutures that are posterior. That's a very awkward move, and especially when you're in the confined space of the rotator cuff subacromial space. So the message is start from the front, insert to the back, and with the same thought in mind, when we tie, we start from the back and we tie towards the front. The idea being stay out of your own way. Now, the other point that needs to be made about passage of sutures through rotator cuff and rotator cuff surgery in general is that you have to be as comfortable working with the instruments with your right hand, visualizing with your left hand, as you are visualizing with your left hand and working with your right hand, because every other cuff is going to be a right or left shoulder. And the only way you can effectively do this work is to become facile with both hands, both as a stabilizer and a viewer with the arthroscope, and as you have to work with the instruments to pass the actual sutures through the rotator cuff.